morning, everybody. This is Steve Falconaker. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today, we're going to start a series of discussions on situational leadership and how situational leadership might overlay with the ChangeGrid and ultimately how we can use this to help our clients more effectively. So I'm sure that a lot of you, if not all of you, are familiar with situational leadership. It's been around for the better part of 50 years now, and it's part of the Human Resource Development Hall of Fame. And it's one of these models that we find very, very frequently has been at least experienced by or adopted by a lot of our corporate clients. So there's just a lot of I want to say, substance in the model, and there's a lot of acceptance in the marketplace around this model. But for me, the question is always, well, how does this overlay on the ChangeGrid? So I'll tell you my little story about situational leadership, how I came to learn about it, and then we'll go from there. So way back when I was probably 20, 21 years old, maybe 22, but before I went off on my own in any way, shape, or form, I worked for a company in Detroit who sold medical surgical supplies. And the owner of that company had a son who was in college, and the son was studying leadership. And one of the things that he got to do, or somehow they arranged to do, is that he went to California and lived with the Blanchards for about a month while he was being trained in situational leadership before it was packaged as something that could be taken out to large corporations, or to commercialize it, back when it was more of an academic thing. In fact, we'll call him Hank because his name was Hank. But Hank was going to the university that Blanchard was teaching at the time. And so this was really more about those early stages. Well, Hank somehow convinced Ken Blanchard to come to Michigan and do a program training people on situational leadership principles. And I was one of the students in that class. So if you can imagine that there was a day when Ken Blanchard's big audience had 8 people in it, and I was one of those 8 people, and we were playing with situational leadership. This is before there had been any kind of split or evolution between Blanchard and Hersey. And we played a board game that was all about situational leadership. And so it was really a very interesting experience to learn the content, but to learn it at the stage of its kind of lifespan that would have happened at. So that's it. So now a lot of you I know are trained in situational leadership. So let's see, let's go ahead and talk about Tom. So Tom, if you want to unmute yourself for just a second, tell people how you came to be associated with situational leadership and how you fit into the whole puzzle. Oh, there he is.
I didn't unmute myself at first. Yeah, so I've bumped into it over the years and had several clients that used it but never got certified in it. But as we were moving toward the virtual age, the Blanchard organization just has really, they use professional actors, really good online learning. And so it was a godsend during pandemic not to have to design all that stuff and get tech people. But I just found it to be really sound. And I listened to Ken Blanchard way back in audio cassette days, not specifically on situational leadership, but just loved his principled centered approach, and also backed by academic research. So the Blanchard organization is world-class. Yep. And I don't agree with all of the stuff, but it's well laid out, and I riff off it like I do with anything.
Absolutely. And they also, Blanchard and maybe even Hersey for the first one, they also pioneered a whole different mindset around the way human development companies, private practices might evolve. So if you guys will remember, they were the champion of the short, thin book. So if you were to pick up one of the original books that had been written about situational leadership, or Situational Leadership 2, or Leadership and the 1-Minute Manager, these were all short reads. Yeah. You guys all remember that? So It's not like some heavy textbook. Usually these things were, I don't know, maybe 100 pages long, and there was a heck of a lot of white space on every single page. And I think it was intended to be something that someone could buy and read on a flight, and pretty much be, be done with it. So I think that was a really great idea about keep something very simple, tell the story in a very succinct and interesting, engaging sort of a way, and be done with it. I just thought that was also a really interesting thing that they contributed to our industry. Who else on the call is a background in situational leadership? Anyone? All right. Are any of you on the call totally unfamiliar, clueless about what situational leadership even is?
See,
No.
my experience is with organization that's installing it for their leadership program, using it as
Yes.
their track. So that's how I came across situational leadership.
Okay. Good. And so you two then are probably encountering a client who's using situational leadership too. Or a variation on that. And Kevin is sharing with everyone. Do that. Oh, by the way, if you guys want to be chatting, do make sure you set your chat to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, I think I'm the only one who sees it. So yeah. Okay. So, all right, let me tell you just a little bit. When I learned it, it was obviously situational leadership one, which is the diagram on the screen you see on the left side of things. So back then, now this isn't their original diagram. I honestly couldn't find their original diagram that would have been pictured in the book. So this was the closest I could get, and it was poor resolution, but it's probably the best representation of what it originally, how it was originally presented. So the thought was that there were 4 different leadership styles that were labeled style 1, 2, 3, and 4, S1, S2, S3, S4. And each one of those styles had a parallel on the follower side of things that would express their level of readiness. So readiness. And so there was R1, R2, R3, and R4. And so they chose to label each one of those styles with a key word. And those styles were S1 was telling, S2 was selling, S3 participating, S4 delegating. Now, if you start looking at different diagrams that are depicting situational leadership, do not be at all surprised to find that those labels have changed. When Ken Blanchard created situational leadership 2, he created the diagram on the right side of things. And again, this isn't his original diagram. This is just the closest one to his I could find. But S1, S2, S3, S4, but now the key verb for each one was directing, coaching, supporting, and delegating. And instead of having readiness levels, he would speak about development levels and talk about development levels featured also 2 different characteristics. Those characteristics were competence and commitment. That was not part of situational leadership 1. Situational leadership 1 was just about readiness. How ready are they to do whatever it is that needed to be done? And so if the individual was a brand new person, they were an R1, well, then you would want to use that S1 style. So the R1 wasn't very ready at all. They needed to be told what to do. So the style was a blend of what kinds of behaviors you as the leader were delivering on and kind of what blend of those behaviors. So the S1 style, the telling style, featured a high degree of task behavior or directive behavior, as what it would be called now in situational leadership 2. And the other kind was relationship behavior or supportive behavior, as situational leadership 2 would put into it. Now, maybe it's because I'm old school, and maybe it's because the way I learned it the first time I learned it, but I still favor the original labels. I think the original labels, again, just my humble opinion, but the original labels were very straightforward, very easy to understand the distinctions between them, and I think easy for an audience member to embrace. At a certain point in time, Ken and Paul decided to go their own different ways as far as their business enterprises were concerned. And at the moment of that change, then Ken went with situational leadership 2, changed a bunch of the labels, but also changed a lot of the underlying research and principles and applications and all that sort of a thing. Now, certainly Ken Blanchard has gone on to do far, 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 far more with that model and all kinds of spin-off sorts of things than Hersey did. I mean, you guys probably would go like, oh, I remember that name, but not in any kind of recent sorts of developments. For all I know, Paul has passed away. I really have no idea what the man's doing. But that being said, I was fascinated by this because I thought, all right, how does this overlay on the change grid? And I would say to you that I learned situational leadership before the change grid or the strategic framework came into form. And so the first emerging of brilliance, the first strategic framework, if you will, came around in 1984. And that would have been maybe a year or two after I had first been exposed to situational leadership. Situational leadership originally started in the late 1960s, I think 1969, in fact, and then it got fleshed out in the 70s, and by late 1970s, I think the situational leadership one model was really out there being marketed and um, shared with whoever was resonating with it. And then, things happened. So anyway, that's my recollection of the history of it, how it all came to be. And so let's kind of jump a little bit. So, well, what is this model all about? This model basically says that a leader needs to be aware of and sensitive to where their follower happens to be. And situational leadership one seems to have focused more on the person as a whole, where when you move into situational leadership two, the conversation becomes much more, where are they when it comes to a task specific question and answer. So instead of the individual as a whole moving along this developmental process, it's no, we're all moving along our own developmental path at the activity specific level. And so right there, I kind of went like, okay, well, this is definitely resonating with that and blah, blah, blah. And very quickly, the first merging of brilliance ended up occurring. So let's take a look at the first model, and then we'll take another look at the second model. But an R1, someone who has very low level of readiness. And so what do they need? They need a high level of task input and not so much relationship, because an R1 would have been characterized as a newbie. They don't know what they're doing, but hey, they took the job. So it's like your first day at the office, you have no idea what to do, but boy, are you enthusiastic to be there. And so you're kind of like a bit of a sponge, not only ready to take whatever guidance you get, but desperate to get that guidance from someone. And so the right thing for the leader to do at that point in time was to provide you with a high level of task input, but not so much relationship, because you're okay for now. Well, their belief was that an R1 would sooner or later evolve as they learned more and more. That task input started to lock in. They would evolve into an R2, and an R2 was someone whose level of ability had certainly increased, but for whatever reasons, their level of commitment was now starting to fall. Now I'm using a little bit of Ken Blanchard's language in situational leadership too. So their competency has gone up somewhat, but now for some reason, their level of commitment is starting to fall. So let me throw this to you guys as a question, and throw out whatever personal experiences you might have or your understanding of this kind of concept. Why is it that someone who's brand new to something and is clueless is very excited, but as they learn more, their level of commitment will go down? Why would that happen? And by the way, Blanchard and Hersey were saying this is normal, predictable. So this is, this is definitely what's going to happen, by and large. So what would you guys say? So again, you don't need to raise your hand. Just feel free.
You get frustrated.
Mhm.
When you start, you're just like, I can do all this. They tour the place and you're so excited. And then when you start digging into it, your understanding moves faster than your competence. So you start doubting yourself. I mean, it's totally tension management.
Yeah, that's where we're going to end up.
I thought of that when I was first exposed to it. It would be real helpful if you just went ahead and talked about productive tension, because it's throughout this whole process.
Yep.
But I'll let it emerge. But it's
yeah,
just, they have this enthusiastic beginner, and then they call it the frustrated learner. And it happens 100% of the time when we learn something new. You say, you and Linda say, oh, we're going to learn French really fast. But
yep,
fast is relative. When you
right,
start knowing more, you
right.
realize you're not as good as you thought.
Yeah, no, exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, many of you have unmuted, so feel free, chime in. What are your thoughts?
I was going to say it goes along with the conscious competence model of being into that. You don't know, in the first quadrant where you're in the directing or the low competence area, you're in the you don't know what you don't know, and then you move into that you know what you don't know, which is really uncomfortable for people, particularly if they're highly competent to begin with. And they move into the quadrant where they don't know what they know what they don't know, and they just kind of lose motivation because it's really hard and you don't like being incompetent, which is just what Tom was saying.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think also because you have to start doing. So now that you know it, now you got to do it, and you can kind of feel out of control or a sense of anxiety about the performance of it.
Well, I've got a client who's going through this right now, and she says that it has slowed her down so much to deconstruct all of her normal, leadership capabilities, all the ways that she's been a leader before. And now she's learning these new ways to think about stuff, and it really slows her down. So it's very disconcerting because she's very effective and efficient and everything else. So she's going through that period where it's like, this is hard.
Yep.
Plus, thinking about that competency model, I think like from a neuroscience perspective, there's a difference between our attention and what we're actually conscious of. So in other words, the way the brain focuses, the attention is kind of like a spotlight on the stage, if you will, but there's still things in the periphery that's on stage with you, but it's just not in the spotlight. And so it goes back to Chris' point about there's a big difference between you understanding something and then you actually doing it. So the application behaviors are uniquely different than the acquisition behaviors when you actually acquire the knowledge. And so until you get balanced in that, there's going to be that frustration that Jane spoke about.
AT, as Brian was speaking, it made me think about the engagement rings. All depends upon where they would probably fall on that scale, whether they're still in awareness or they're moving forward to actually execution that's going to create that experience for them.
And we will be looking at that ever so shortly. It's true. I'll give you guys the little story I've always used to illustrate this. So again, imagine you're someone who's brand new to the job. Well, you got interviewed, and probably during that interview, whoever was interviewing you is telling you what the job was going to be and what you could expect. And so you walked out of that experience with a certain kind of image in your mind of what things were going to be like and how it was all going to be. And so if they told you, oh, we're a group of very open and understanding people and the work is very blah blah, I mean, they kind of sold you a little bit on taking the job. Well, that means you're coming into this job with expectations. You have your own fantasy isn't fair, but you have your own sort of image of what things are going to look and feel and sound and be like. Well, you show up and they're giving you all the task input, and for a while you're going, this is really just fine. Okay, good. I'm learning this, I'm learning this. But as you start to learn more and more, you start to notice that this image you had in your mind and the reality don't match, or what you were told to expect and what you are actually experiencing just don't match. Or the work that you thought was going to be so interesting ends up being not so interesting. And so all those things are happening. And while you might be going, all right, well, fine, I'm here, I have a job, okay, what else now? What do I need to learn? So your kind of enthusiasm starts to wane a little bit, or you might even be thinking, oh my gosh, is this what I was getting myself into? Is this what's happening kind of here? And so for many, many different reasons, your level of enthusiasm, your level of commitment, whatever word you want to use, could definitely be taking a hit. Now, in Blanchard's model, or the original situation, they would say, well, that's when the leader needs to stop telling and kick in some selling. And that selling is about recognizing that this person is kind of losing interest or is concerned about something, troubled by something because it was like more than they were expecting or less than they were expecting. So one way or another, we need that leader to come along and say, let me throw in a little bit of so you can understand why we do the things we want to do, why it might be different. So I'm trying to explain to them what the backstory is, what are the benefits. So, and letting them know, this is, everyone goes through this period, but as you emerge from this, you'll be able to take more control, you'll be able to blah, blah, blah. So even this little diagram shows explaining would move someone up the curve, persuading, they say, would move them down the curve. I don't really necessarily agree with that, because if your persuasion abilities don't increase someone's level of excitement, then you're not very good at persuading people. So I disagree with what direction their arrow is pointing. But that being said, we need to come along at a certain point, recognize that S1 is all about telling people what to do. And the S2 style includes more about why we're doing it. Why is it valuable? Why have we chosen whatever approach we're using for whatever we happen to be using?
May I
Please
make
do.
a comment about where I think the SL2 labels have improved?
Sure.
And so one is that instead of relationship, we use the word support. And that's helpful because relationship should always be holistic. In other words, I want to consider your development as a human being because I care about you. But support is, what kind of support would be helpful to T on this goal or task? So it's not that I don't care about the others, but you said, gee, help me to learn French. And so support is much better than relationship there. And the other thing that Chris reminded me of is that initially it was leadership training, but now what they're discovering is that people say we're all responsible for the development of our people at every level of an organization. We all should be leaders, even individual contributors. But they don't really have a framework to help them to do this. So the framework is to say, if you look at a team, let's look at the goals and the tasks and see where they are in development. The why is wanting them to expand. The what is the how. And you have to pay attention to both, which is the point I want to make on this S2, is this idea, if you were my sailing instructor and the first day we went out, the wind came and the boat was going to capsize, and you took a coaching approach, gee, Tom, what do you think we ought to do? Well, that's foolish. You take charge and keep us from capsizing. Then afterwards, you tell me what you did. But if we went all summer and you were my coach, and then the wind blew and we were starting to capsize, and then you just took over, I'm going to say, he's a yacht captain, not a teacher.
There you go.
So what we're going for here, and it is all tension management, is to say, you've had some time to play around with this. I'm not just going to jump in and be directive. I'm going to ask you, what are you running into? What are you thinking? And so the language in SL2 is S1, I'll decide. So T just says, do this. This is what we find works. S2 say, let's talk, and then I'll decide.
That's
and
right.
S3 is, let's talk and you decide. So it's building autonomy over time, and time is not chronological, it's developmental. But I just want to add, and I'll shut up, but I just want to say in support, it's much more helpful because I look at you holistically, but you're stuck somewhere. And it doesn't matter if you've been in the company for 25 years or you're brand new, you're stuck. I want to find out where you're stuck in development language and just ask what kind of support would be useful. And I see this all the time where people get promoted and they say, well, she's a seasoned executive. She'll figure it out. She's bright. She's seasoned. And the answer is yes, she is. And yes, she will. And she has transferable skills. But in this new role, she needs D1 support, not for 3 years, for 2 hours.
Right. Exactly right.
Tell me what
exactly
to do and I'll do it. That
Yep.
sounds like tension management.
That sounds like tension management. Exactly right.
This whole thing is a tension management model.
It absolutely is. So now let me draw it. Oh, first of all, you guys need to know a correction. This diagram you're looking at on the right, here they say low directive and low support. That's not true. This is high directive and low support. And this is low directive and low support over here. So they've just had a typo there. It's correct up top, but it's wrong on the bottom. Yeah, so I think that the point of this S2 style is that I, as the leader, have to recognize that while I still have content to convey to the individual, that at a certain point in time, I'm going to need to delegate to them. And so I need to make sure that they are learning and okay with what they know, but not losing interest. That to me is the big deal when it comes to this. I don't want this person, when they become an S2, to say either this is more than I thought I could handle, I'm out of here, or this is nowhere near as challenging as I thought it was going to be, but you know what, it's not so bad, so I'm just going to fly under the radar. Later on in our little series of discussions here, you're going to learn about something that we added to situational leadership when we did the merging, and that is this thing called the critical management moment. The critical management moment is where you transfer the ownership of the task to the individual. And on the right side of this diagram, the ownership of the situation of the task or whatever continues to rest with the leader. But when you move to the other side, now the ownership has to be transferred. So I'm just going to throw this to you guys as a giant question that you'll see how it actually maps out. But tell me what happens if the leader spends far, far, far more than an appropriate amount of time telling, followed by far, far, far more than appropriate time selling, or far more time directing than is necessary or appropriate, and then far more time coaching than is necessary.
Disengagement.
Disengagement. What's happening from a tension management perspective?
Well, either, I mean, it could be two extremes. You could go to apathy or stress. I could say, I don't want to work here because T just tells me what to do. I'm not going to grow. Or it could be like, well, whatever, I'll just wait around and see what T says, in which case I'm not growing, and mediocrity might happen and I might settle for it. Or I might say, I got to go somewhere where there's more challenge.
Yep. And so, and as I was saying, like when your reality and your fantasy confront one another, you're either going to go, this is a lot more than I was bargaining for, I'm out of here, in which case your level of tension went way up, way fast at that critical management moment, or you kind of went like, okay, well, this isn't as interesting as I thought it was going to be, but I'm well paid, don't feel like job hunting anymore. I'll just fly under the radar. This is cool enough. In which case I have someone who I will, because of my own way of leading them, end up becoming kind of a, what do I say, minimum performance standard sort of person. So we have to be sensitive to this. And in all my experience with situational leadership, there has never been a discussion about how much is enough. How does the S1 leadership style recognize when it's time to move on to the S2? What are these incremental awarenesses? What are these key things I need to be looking for that tell me it's time to move forward? Now, in the good old days of situational leadership 1, the answer was just pay attention to your follower. Your follower dictates how fast you move through these styles. You don't, as the leader, dictate how quickly you'll move through these styles based on the leader. It's all driven by the readiness. And that disturbed a whole lot of business owners and business leaders early on, particularly those that were more autocratic by nature.
Right.
thought tell is the only thing I can do and everything I ever will do. And why should I have to sell them on do it? Just do what I'm telling you to do, you know?
So what's missing is the change grid, because it's situational, as they say, and it's individual, as they say, and it's goal or activity specific.
That's
and
right.
so the videos they use, and they're quite good, you can clearly see what's needed. And then they have conversation guides, which help the manager or leader to raise, to see what the tension is, but they don't have a framework for adjusting to it.
There you go. There you go.
It's guesswork.
Yep. David, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I wrote an article years ago called "You Can't Lead Any Faster Than They Can Follow."
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that gets back to the hiring process. I don't mean to always relate back to that, but you got to figure this out before you hire them. You got to figure out if they're an S1, S2, S3, S4, and if they have the capacity to change.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Or the desire.
Yeah, right.
Or the desire.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's right. Yep. Yeah, and so I think that this is a really important thing to just kind of keep in mind. We can teach people the value of situational leadership, and Lord knows Blanchard and all of his certified team have been doing it, and doing it quite well if you just want to measure their success from a financial perspective. But how often are they encountering supposed leaders who have no behavioral flexibility, who lack the emotional intelligence, who lack even the interest in doing what situational leadership would say is what needs to be done?
I think that's how somebody ends up in an S2 with an incompetent leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there an assessment for this? Because I seem to remember reading a lot.
They do. There's a leadership behavioral analysis.
Yep.
And there's also an app that's wonderful. So you think of a specific, it's one of the simplest apps. You think of a specific goal or task or a person, and you ask a series of questions, and then it puts it at the development level, and it cautions you that you only can know a development level by engaging in conversation. But this guesswork, and that's all it is, this assumption is good because you ask different questions in your one-to-one conversation, thinking that they're at this development level. That's so right. They do have very good tools, and not just putting a it's absolutely true. If they use the change grid along with it, because I've done it, they can do much better evaluation on what the heck to do.
Yep. So let's talk for just a second about if we have people out there that are hanging on to that S1 style too long. We also have a whole bunch of people who tend to go S4 too soon, and that is delegate. So the assumption is that this person has a very high level of competence, and so I'm hiring a great person. I know I hired a great person. Let them show up. I'll give them a day's worth of orientation. Then we got to get them out there and do it. And so I'm delegating prematurely to them.
And that happens to me most in the area of sales.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, tell us more about that.
Well, you know, they hire someone who says, I'm a great prospector, I'm a great closer. My organic growth has been steady for the last 5 years. And they do a little bit of background and they see that some of that is true. So they bring them on board, they give them an orientation, and they let them go.
Yep. And unfortunately, they're setting themselves up for what, I don't know if this is a Blanchard and Hersey thing or where it came from, but you're setting them up for a leave alone zap. Anyone heard leave alone zap before?
Say it again.
A leave alone zap.
Oh, leave alone zap.
Leave alone zap. And so what you end up doing is, because you delegate prematurely, you're kind of leaving them alone. Just do whatever they're doing. And then, so they of course go like, well, they must have so much faith and confidence in me. I'm just going to go ahead and do the best I can do. And so that individual goes off, does things the best way they know how. Unfortunately, they find out that their way of doing things did not match what this leader actually had in mind. And so now the person gets zapped. They get slapped back, and they get, harshly reviewed, or they get, they go, what the heck were you thinking? All that sort of stuff. And of course, what does that now do to that individual's willingness to accept any sort of delegation moving forward? What does that do to their
Lack of
ability
trust. It's so funny. I watch this show. I have it on my laptop next to me, my iPad next to me, called Bar Rescue. And John Taffer, who's the host, goes in and he raises tension very quickly with pointing out all the errors and tries to get people to the threshold. And the problem is that a lot of these owners have never trained their staffs, but delegate to them. And when they find out there's a problem, they blame the staff.
Yep.
And I think Brian's information on feedback is very helpful here, because delegation is often treated like an event rather than a process.
Right.
And so somebody tells them, you've got to delegate. Next thing you know, they dump all these files on David's desk.
Right.
Good luck with that. And they have no given feedback. And then they say feedback we'll do quarterly. Well, any feedback, even if it's done well in performance reviews, if you haven't given any feedback between quarters, nobody can process it. And so it has to be continuous conversations, and understand that this development level zigs and zags. You wouldn't be good on the poster to put it that way, but it's constantly zigging and zagging.
You just described, I think, how performance management needs to evolve. Instead of an event, it needs to be a process.
Yeah.
That's right.
Learning is always a process. And it's not treated that way in school. You take the test and you get an A, and they say, and so one of my clients, they hire nothing but the best and the brightest, and it's a relatively flat organization, and these bright young people are totally clueless how to navigate it, because they're used to having a syllabus handed out and here's what you got to do to get the A, and if you did that, these people would rock.
That's right. Well, and so certainly I think that what we're trying to illustrate here is that there are a lot of S1 leaders out there, and there are a lot of S2, S4 leaders out there. It's this introduction and understanding, appreciation, embracing of an S2 and S3 style and progression that is what was missing. And so this is where I thought, okay, well, why do I need to do these two in-betweens? And my thought was that it's because something is happening with their level of tension, and to manage their tension effectively, I need to modify what I'm doing as the person who's trying to influence them. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a background sort of a thing. And by the way, the difference between selling and participating in the old way of doing things is that at a certain point in time, you already know more than half of what I can tell you as far as that directive or task-focused behavior was concerned. So at a certain point, I have to be able to say to you, we've trained you quite well up to now. You know what to do, and you know why we do it the way that we do it. So now I want to understand what your thoughts are around that. So now I'm trying to do a little bit more participation and say, so how do you apply what you've learned? How would you do this situation? And so, as Tom pointed out, this is where we have a conversation, but ultimately I'm going to let that R3 make whatever decision it needs to be made. So participating, I like that idea about supportive behavior. Because, by the way, in the old days, it wasn't relationship behavior and task behavior. It was task input and relationship input. So, yeah. So, and then, when you figure out, hey, at a certain point in time, I've pretty much told them everything I can tell them, and I've sold them on every reason why, and they've proven that they can, take ownership of it and move things in a nice sort of direction. I need to step back and let them do it and do their thing. So this all seemed to match. And so I kind of appreciated the style curve and all that sort of thing, but I kind of went like, I don't like this readiness scale. I don't like this development scale, and to this day I still don't, because I don't understand why the leader gets a curve, but the follower gets a continuum along a line. It's like, no way. That readiness level will be far easier for someone to understand, to recognize, and respond to if it too is depicted as a curve. And so one of the very first things that I did was I said, I want to know what the readiness curve looks like. And so that's what I ended up putting together. To this day, there is no readiness curve when it comes to situational leadership.
No, they still use the same model where the development is in a straight line.
Yeah, and I don't see,
right.
I don't see
and
how
it isn't
that's
the way, it's not accurate even in the way they describe it.
right.
But it just makes the picture easy to put on a
Absolutely
poster.
right.
But
Absolutely right. But I
missing.
think that is a serious,
I do.
well, I'll call it instead a serious flaw. I would say we've made a valuable contribution to their understanding of it. And by the way, you'll notice how they always put the starting point was in the lower right corner of this. Well, that disturbed some people rather greatly. In fact, let me go over to my PowerPoint. I actually did a PowerPoint on this just to make it a little easier. And then of course I abandoned it the moment we started class. But someone said, no, we don't want highs on the lows on the one and highs on the other. We want to change it around so that now lows are at the corner and highs. No, that's still the same one. It was this one who said, no, we should have highs at the origin and the lows on over there. Let's move the whole point. So now instead of looking at the grid, if you look at the Cartesian coordinate plane, looking at the upper right, now let's look at the upper left. And so I think people have been trying to say we need to find some way to reposition this curve so it makes more sense for people to have. So lots of play has happened by lots of people who were authorized to and not authorized to do whatever they felt would be useful in that. Well, I came along and I said, all right, fine, I got this grid. And I know I've got these 4 energies. And the one thing that parallels what situational leadership was saying was this perceived ability thing. How much ability do I perceive that I have? Because Blanchard in Situational Leadership 2 defined competence as the level of knowledge, skill, and experience. We define ability as knowledge, skill, and experience. And so I went like, all right, right there, competency, we know parallels the ability scale. And so then I was able to say, okay, fine. Well, then maybe we say that the S1 style is something we would use when someone has low competency because they're telling us that. And the S2 would be when they have this somewhat increased level of competency, and the S3 when they have some other level of competency, and S4 when they are pretty fully competent. So that kind of made sense. But then I went, yeah, but what's going on with perceived challenge at the individual level? Which got us to the next little diagram. And that is, well, that S1 type is appropriate when people not only are reporting a low level of ability, but seeing a higher level of challenge. And in the S2, now the level of challenge has reduced dramatically. It continues to be low when my ability continues to increase, and ultimately I end up as this outgrid sort of style. So without me giving you guys any more detail, does that resonate with you? Yes.
Well, it does, except for the fact that they've got delegation as a key word for S4, and we've got them outgrid.
Because that individual should be outgrid.
Should be, yes.
Right. And see, this is where I was kind of going like, where's the curve? Where's the readiness curve? And so if I said, I'm going to change the S's and the D's, or rather change the D to an R1, or what am I saying? I need to use the S4 style when they're a D4. So the curve ended up floating on top of it, kind of in this strange sort of, if I just did it as a straight line, it would go from there to 6 for ability, and 6 for ability would then move out. But to make it more graceful, you could end up turning that into a bit of a curve. Okay, so without jumping too far ahead, this is what I ended up with. So basically, we would be looking at the difference between ability and situational leadership wanted to use the word commitment because they would saying that as your commitment increases, your motivation would also increase or whatever. So if I find something very challenging and I'm in the position where I can avoid it, how committed am I likely to be?
Not very.
Not very committed. Now, if I have no choice because I'm in a life or death situation, well, then I have to rise to the occasion and do whatever I can do. So I will be committed because I'm forced to commit. But take those kind of situations out of the range of possibilities for a second and just say, look, I know that when I am brand new to a job, my ability is very low. And so, but my commitment is quite high. And therefore, the style would be a high level of task input, but not so much relationship, or if you want to say supportive behavior, whatever. That's just not what really is demanding there to bring things into balance. What I'm missing as an R1 is the ability to handle something. And I'm hungry for someone to tell me what it is that I need to know. So somebody please tell me what it is that I'm supposed to do and how I'm supposed to do it and all that. So it is the readiness curve that is dictating what happens on the style kind of curve. I'm telling you as the R1, I'm hungry, feed me. And so tell me what I need to know. Well, then as someone said earlier, as my ability goes up, I start to notice mismatches. I start to notice things I'm not particularly thrilled by or whatever. And so I'm enabled, but I might be feeling a little bit tentative. So, because my commitment is falling for the reasons we talked about before. Somewhere we're going to encounter a critical management moment. And if that leader's ability to sell me on all the reasons why we do what it is, or one way or another, give me enough support that I know that I should stick around longer or I should invest longer, even if I don't, what do I say, resign in place. I don't want to do that. I'm going to stay involved. So I need to know that they've done that. They got to meet that critical management moment at the right place. Now, this little curve shows that critical management moment occurs when commitment is at its absolute lowest. So I'm going to give you guys a little statement and see what you play with it. How would you evaluate a leader who waits until commitment is at its all-time lowest before you bother doing anything to now empower or participate with that individual?
Well, you're not an S2 or an S3 style leader. You're an S4 style leader.
Right. You weren't really paying attention. And so you just kind of went on too long. Other thoughts on what I'm getting to here is that I don't need to wait until commitment is at an all-time low before I begin to transfer ownership. Before I do this, I've always said the voyage along the leadership or the readiness curve does not have to be long in terms of time or heavy in terms of the amount of interaction I have with someone. I just need what's appropriate for me. And as I'm ready to move forward, I need that leader to move forward with me or help me understand that I'm overestimating my readiness to move ahead. You guys with me on that?
You want the tension to go up, but you don't want it to go up into stress.
I don't want to go up into stress. And
So
I certainly
power apathy. Power stress would be good.
That's right.
And then you see what they do with it, and they should go up and out, and then come back down when they gain confidence.
That's right. Now, talking to
otherwise they're bored.
They're going to be bored, in which case they will resign in place. Or they're going to be
too long, they're going to be freaked out because all of a sudden you haven't said anything and you come in sort of passive aggressive.
Right.
You're not moving very fast here, team.
Right. So they'll run away. Either way, that critical management moment has to be understood. The concept of the critical management moment does not exist in situational leadership. But because of our focus on tension management, we know that there is nothing more important than for someone to recognize when that critical management moment is happening. Because look what I called it, a critical management moment. It's not a period of time measured in days and weeks. It is a moment that they better be able to recognize, or they're going to end up paying the price.
It does exist in the model.
Does
And
it?
yes, it
What
does.
are
But what the gap you've identified, the whole thing that we're talking about today, is without the tension management language,
Right.
it's hard to know what to do with it. But it
Yeah.
exists in two things: one-to-one conversations and alignment conversations. Alignment conversations are meant to get agreement between the manager and the employee on what level they're at and what kind of support would be helpful and what kind of time frame. So without the tool of the tension grid, they've identified differing perceptions about what's needed and different learning styles that I just want to stick up for the organization that it is definitely in the mix, because there's 4 conversations you need to have, and 2 of them directly address what you're talking about, which is aligning your perception of what it takes rather than before. And this is where Blanchard set himself apart. Before, we would always talk about the leader style and not the learner style. So
Right.
T is a hands-off manager. And then a bunch of people say, that's great, we like that. We get to delegation sooner. But somebody else would say, oh, he's a micromanager. And what we are doing here is to say that over management and under management happen not just by the leader style, but the interaction between the leader style and the learner style. And I give Blanchard credit for that distinction.
No, that's excellent, because in situational leadership 1, there was none of what you've just said existed. So that's something that came as part of the evolution of the model, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I mean, obviously I love the model because I'm going to show you where it ended up integrating. I did try to get it to overlay on the ChangeGrid. Lord knows I tried to get it to overlay on the ChangeGrid. And while I could build a case for the R1 to be up in stress or power stress, I've been like, well, that's not necessarily the case. They might just be in power. They might even be in power apathy because they think it's going to be easy. So, okay, that's not really working. And then I went like, and yeah, I can get that once someone is an R4, they're ready to take charge and move ahead. So I was like, well, that's definitely an outgrid kind of behavior. So I just kind of played with it and played with it. And I went like, and how come we're never spending any time in power stress? What's really going on in all this? And so what I realized was that the model as it's shown does not overlay on the ChangeGrid. It overlays on the MasterStream. And so when I did, this is the first merging of brilliance in 1984, I had stumbled across all kinds of models, some of them, by the way, after the fact. It's interesting, after I first presented this particular model, someone said, oh, you know, that sounds like blah, blah, blah. And I went like, really? Never heard of that. Let's go look. And so I would go look at it, like, lo and behold, it does. So there you are. You can be part of the after the fact merging. But I said, you know, what's really happening is when I think about that employee who's brand new on the job and they're ready to receive whatever guidance they need, I would say on that day, their level of tension is probably quite high. Right. So think about that, you guys. When you first take a job, you know, you walk in, there's lots of anticipation, there's lots of excitement. You're not up in stress, but there is this kind of like excited, energized, motivated, upgrade kind of a thing. And I believe you're at the threshold of activation because you're the one who's, by the fact that you've shown up, you've said, all right, tell me what it is you got to tell me. Teach me what you need to teach me. I'm ready. What do you got? What do you got? What do you got? And so, I thought, well, you know, these 2 phases of the mastery, and by the way, if you guys haven't had any exposure to our sales model, we do talk about that over the course of time, the level of tension is going to change in the prospect. And you as their leader, you as the salesperson, needs to make sure that anything you can do to keep them in stream is exactly what you do. Because if they're not in stream, they're on the shore. That means they're not going anywhere. We got to keep them in stream. So what can we do? Yes.
I was just going to say, the one thing that you always said that made so much sense to me here is that line represents the ideal flow of tension.
Absolutely.
In sales call.
Absolutely. And so, and now we're going to apply that to leadership in just a second now. So what we're looking at here in this little dip in phase 3. So by the way, connecting is all the interpersonal sorts of stuff that has to happen. And then analyzing is asking all the questions so you can learn what it is, the gap is, whatever the case may be. It's interesting that in most leadership programs, neither one of those two phases get any real time anyway. But I believe before you get ready to have any kind of a meaningful management or leadership attempt, you really should make sure you got some sort of foundation on the relationship side of things to have that trust and have all that. And you really should know what the heck you're doing. So you need to have done some analyzing with or without the involvement of that individual, but you're about to make some sort of recommendation. You're about to provide some sort of task input. Well, how did you come to decide what task input to provide? Someone had to have done some analysis to make that happen. So this whole idea about situational leadership and where it supposedly begins, it begins deeper down the curve than I think a lot of people would understand. So we've always said to our leadership clients and management clients, it's like, you got to make sure you can do phase 1 and phase 2, because if you're just going to jump in and do situational leadership, it may not be very effective at all. Thoughts about that? Anybody?
No, there's no. I mean, I love the keywords that you use to indicate the objectives of each phase. So rapport, credibility, and interest in the connecting phase absolutely should be a function of leadership prior to any kind of task assignment or delegation. And the analytics of finding out what the level of tension is and raising it to the appropriate level are all things that a leader should prepare for before this event.
Exactly. And I think that resonates very much with what Tom was saying earlier. It's kind of like, all right, if we got a brand new employee, they're not all starting from the exact same spot. They all have different levels of knowledge, skill, experience they're coming to it with. So do I really want to put everybody through the exact same orientation and onboarding process?
What comes up here with the MasterStream? Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No. Or do I need to try to customize it? I mean, I understand everyone needs to know where the lunchroom is, and when they can.
I was thinking about the maneuvers, and if you don't have the grid, you're going to do the same thing coaches do often when we try to sell, is we normalize, which makes people feel good. It just doesn't make them buy. And they say, every time I get stressed, I want to go have a cup of coffee with Tom, but they're not going to pay me. And the same thing happens, especially in D2, is if you care about them, is a real temptation to just say everybody experiences that frustration. While that may be true, it's not helpful. Right. I need to know how you're experiencing it, so I know where you are on that stream, so I know whether you need up, out, in, or down.
That's correct. That's correct. And so if you look at what's happening here, if you could just take that readiness curve that we were looking at on the slide beforehand, I need this to be rotated. Well, that would be 90 degrees, 180 degrees, I guess. Don't flip it, but rotate it 180 degrees, which would now mean this little spot right there that I'm clicking at is actually at the very beginning. So here we're looking at this is R1. This little segment here is R2. This is R3. This is R4. And so this curve that you're seeing on the MasterStream is actually the curve that represents the follower or the person you're trying to influence or impact. And interestingly enough, I went then, so I'm going to turn the leadership behaviors into a continuum. So it's like telling, selling, participating, delegating. And those words, by the way, when we introduced or integrated this into a sales methodology, they were able to really, sales representatives were able to really quickly embrace what it is we're trying to accomplish here. Because the telling part of any sales presentation is all about what are the features? These are the features. These are the features. This is, based on what you said, this is blah, blah, blah. Well, now I need to move forward, because what happens to your level of tension the moment you find out that a solution to your problem is readily available? We'll do that again. All y'all unmute. What happens to your
Goes
level?
down. It
Goes
goes
down.
down.
Right.
Decrease.
Because just the knowledge that a solution is available allows you to breathe that sigh of relief. And unfortunately, for you to actually follow through, commit, and do the best you could possibly do doesn't happen when tension is on its way down. It's got to get built back up. And so when we talk again on Tuesday, I want to talk about how what we teach in these different phases. So in for those who don't know, MasterStream has a step-by-step protocol that tells the person exactly what to do at just a particular moment in time in order to make sure that this curve ends up staying as ideal as possible. So notice this curve stays entirely in power stress. There's no reason for me to move a prospect or a follower, an employee, down into power apathy, or gosh knows, not down to apathy. As I'm doing all this. And so we're going to be talking about how this actually plays out when we're trying to work with an individual. And by the time we're done, we'll also talk about how this actually gets used in every coaching discussion you have with someone, in every consulting discussion you have with someone, how you also want to be following the MasterStream. Okay, so thoughts about what we've covered today?
Oh, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yep. And so, so we'll get into a lot more detail about how this kind of overlays. By the way, I did share this with the good folks at Blanchard years ago, and they just thought it was more complicated than their clients could wrap their heads around. So we're like, no, it's not the case, because obviously creating a synergistic relationship with them could have been very, very powerful.
I ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Is environment considered in this model in terms of how it impacts the behavior of the leader and the person that's following?
Well, I think, Tom, you can certainly.
Yeah, well,
throw in,
absolutely. They're doing a lot of research on culture
Yeah.
and how if you bring in SL2, or we could say this to anything, whether it's diversity, inclusion, or whatever modality you're talking about, if the culture doesn't support it, it's just a lot of interesting conversations going nowhere.
Yeah.
So
And also,
if you don't have an environment and you say, okay, it's time to do coaching, but the environment says, I worked with an organization that they hired us to do managers coaching negotiation, and it was well received, and it fell flat on its face because the manager kind of liked this thing that they had to approve everything.
Yep.
And so
didn't have a chance.
So yes, environment is part of it. It's what is contributing to the whole goal of this is to have employees. They used to use the word autonomous, but now they call it self-reliant achievers. And I like that better than autonomous, because we don't want people working autonomously. We want them working collaboratively. So the idea is about ownership. And T touched on that. So T is now someone we delegate to. He owns it, which doesn't mean he has to figure it all out. Part of figuring it out is calling Tom and saying, "Can you support me on this?"
That's right.
I'm experiencing just in this little piece of the goal some D2, and to keep those conversations going and to recognize it's always situational,
Yes.
relative to a task or a goal. So that environment's part of it.
That's right.
Awesome.
One other thing I'll say about the environment is that when we're talking about events that happen like a pandemic, you can imagine that that's going to dramatically impact every aspect of a company's thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, at least in the short run, until they figure some things out. So what happens when you're in the process of doing some situational leadership or some developmental work with someone, and all of a sudden a pandemic occurs? Well, you might have been close to moving on to an S3 style or even S4 style, and suddenly you need to rewind a little bit. because now a lot of that core task input, that knowledge about how are we going to handle things and why do we want to do it the way we're going to do it, these things need to be answered, and that could change a whole lot of what was the person was experiencing or anticipating.
I actually think the pandemic took a lot of S2 and S3 leaders and moved them back.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David, earlier you said, and it was very pithy about it's always a process. I read research that said 60-some% of companies are doing a reorg. And I read that and I instantly said, no, 100% of companies are doing a reorg now.
They just don't realize it.
Yeah, I mean, their building's empty. They might
there
not
you
have
go.
proclaimed a reorg. And so what an opportunity for all of us to support people. And I'm realizing that people will come and say, we need to do virtual meetings better. And they never learned how to do original meetings.
There you go.
So it's a
Exactly
great
right.
opportunity
Exactly
to
right.
sneak the fundamentals, because they got 20 years experience. They wouldn't do meetings at work. But now
That's
you
right.
call it virtual meetings at work, and it's all the same stuff. It's kindergarten stuff, but it's
I
not
actually
common
just got a
practice.
client who wants me to train his salespeople on how to use Teams or Zoom to make presentations.
Yep.
Cool.
And they think it's about the technology, but it's really about this real, how are we showing up?
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about around there because obviously now everyone's tension has changed. Not only the salespeople, not only the company, but the prospects. And so all that is, and by the way, in the time of crisis, it's amazing how willing everyone is on the readiness scale to go back to being an R1 and are looking for someone to be the S1 because that's what we need. We're in a crisis. So somebody save
Well
us,
said.
So yeah. Okay. Anywho, that's what I hope to cover for today. So we'll
Fabulous, T. Thank you.
All right. Take
Awesome.
care, everybody. We'll finish
Take
up
care.
on Tuesday. Bye for now.
Bye.